Today we have an informative presentation on trade data on services exports by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Our presenters are Christy Howell, who's an economist for BEA, and Lucas Hitt, who is the Chief of the Communications Division. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. I'll now hand the presentation over to Christy and Lucas.
Thank you, Bronwyn, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, my name is Lucas Hitt. I'm with the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, and I'm here with my colleague, Christy Howell. We're going to talk to you a little bit today about trade and services, including the reports and compliance requirements that we hope you'll all be aware of, as well as the data products that are produced as a result of the data collection that we think could be of great use to you in your daily efforts. So real quickly, we want to give you an overview of how we're going to sort of proceed. First off, I want to just give you a quick snapshot of who is BEA. The Bureau is the principal federal economic statistics agency of the U.S. government. We're part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and we compile key economic statistics, the ones you very often hear on the news when you hear that the government's releasing new economic figures. Usually that's us. These are products such as gross domestic product, personal income, trade and goods and services, balance of payments, a whole slew of regional statistics, including GDP by state, GDP by metro area, personal income by state, metro area, and county, and then industry statistics such as GDP by industry and productivity and CLIM statistics, for example. At this point, one of the things we want to do is just make sure that we're all operating off the sort of the same page of music when it comes to the various sort of key vocabulary when talking about trade. A lot of times these words are sort of used interchangeably and tossed around in general ways. We want to make sure that we're all understanding of the specific meanings of each of these words. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Christy Howell from the International Accountants. Christy.
Okay, thanks. As Lucas said, sometimes these words are used generally, but we have very specific meanings for them when we're talking about statistics. So when we're talking about goods, this is fairly obvious. We're talking about tangible products and commodities, things like wheat and oil that you're usually thinking about when you're talking about trade. On the other hand, when you talk about services, these are intangible economic outputs. They're a little bit harder to define, but these are things that can't be stored, so you have no inventory, say, of accounting services, and they're by definition consumed at the time that the service is produced. Particularly for the statistics that we're talking about today, we're concerned with whether or not we have something that we call an international transaction. And this means that it's an economic transaction involving a U.S. resident and a foreign resident. Now, the definitions for residency can be somewhat difficult to define, but basically when we're talking about a U.S. resident, you're talking about an individual or a company who is residing in the United States. It becomes particularly complicated when you're talking about multinational companies, so this is an important distinction to make. When we're talking about if a U.S. multinational company sets up an affiliate abroad, so say they set up a location in China, that entity is legally established in China, so they're considered to be a Chinese resident, not a U.S. resident. This means that any trade that occurs between the U.S. multinational company, the U.S. parent as we call them, and the foreign affiliate located in China would be considered cross-border trade, a transaction between the U.S. resident and a foreign resident. Now, when we talk about exports, we're talking about goods and services that are sold or provided to a foreigner by a U.S. resident. And then on the other hand, an import is when a good or service is purchased from a foreigner by a U.S. resident. So the word trade can have lots of meanings, but generally when we talk about trade, we are referring to exports and imports of goods and services. However, you'll often see statistics reported, including in statistics by other agencies in the U.S. government that refer to trade, but in fact they're really only talking about trade in goods. So it's important whenever you're looking at a report or looking at any statistics on trade that you make sure you understand whether or not it includes both goods and services or just goods. The next thing we wanted to do was talk a little bit more specifically about what are services transactions. As I said, sometimes they're a little bit harder to define because you can't think of these tangible objects, and particularly it's hard to think about some of these things as being tradable, but we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about why some of these things have become more tradable in recent years. So we've given you just a few examples here. Kind of the classic example of a service transaction is a haircut. But there's other things such as taxi rides and other forms of transportation and so on. Services are something that traditionally you would think of as where the consumer and the producer have to be in close proximity. But what we're seeing as services trade has evolved is that this is no longer the case. So, for example, we have here teaching, and you would have traditionally thought of teaching as being something where a classroom setting where a student would have to be present. But with the advancements in technology, we now have online training where the learner could be located anywhere and the instructor could be located anywhere. So you could conceive of a cross-border transaction in training. This next slide we're showing here is a chart that's giving you some information that you're probably already all aware of, which is that services make up 70% of the U.S. economy, so they're very important for our economy. And this just shows the share that private services producing industries have of GDP and how it's grown over time. And then the corresponding offset is the share of private goods producing industries has fallen over time, mostly due to manufacturing, which is the bottom blue line. So as I said, traditionally you think of services as being something where the consumer and the producer have to be located in close proximity. So what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about trade in services? Well, I'm sure you're familiar with the World Trade Organization and the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. You may not know that there's a similar General Agreement on Trade and Services, and this agreement actually lays out broad categories of service types. GATS defines services by the modes of delivery, or the ways that these services can be delivered. And so what I presented here are the various modes of delivery that we include when we talk about cross-border trade. The first is traditional cross-border trade. So this is where services are delivered often via phone or internet. And the classic example here, of course, is IT support services. So when you call up to get support service on your computer, you could be talking to someone anywhere. And these, of course, are the category of trade and services that have grown rapidly in the last several decades with advancements in technology and declining telecommunication costs. As one presenter I heard recently said, every telephone line or internet connection is now a potential customs port. And that's also an example of why these types of services are hard to capture in the statistics. The other modes of delivery of services include when the consumer travels to the service provider. The example here would be tourism and travel-related services. So, for example, when a foreign resident travels to the U.S., say they come to L.A. and they go on a celebrity home tour and they stay at a hotel in Hollywood, everything that they purchase here is counted as an export of services. And then the last mode of delivery of trade and services that we include is when a service provider travels to the consumer. So you could think of something where a consultant would travel to visit their client, or, for example, where an architect would travel overseas to oversee a construction project. And the reason I went through those examples is then to distinguish those types of trade and service from what's known as services provided through commercial presence. So this is the case of when a multinational company establishes a local presence in another country in order to provide services to that market. The example here would be if McDonald's opens up a location in China. Because that affiliate that they've set up is legally incorporated in China, it's considered to be a Chinese resident. So any services that that location is then providing to Chinese residents is not considered to be trade. However, it is another mode, another way of delivering services internationally. And for that reason, it's obviously very important to capture those as well. And BEA compiles a statistical series on these types of transactions as well. We do report these alongside with the cross-border trade statistics once a year in a report we put out in October. And we feel it's important to look at these two things side by side because you can learn a lot of things. In particular, not that it's surprising, but these types of services delivered through commercial presence are actually 2 times as large as cross-border services trade. And this really gets back to the idea that services often have to be provided where the consumer and the producer are face-to-face. So now that we've gone in a little bit in detail about what trade and services means, we thought we'd show you just a few more charts describing how important they are for the U.S. economy. So this chart shows you the balance on goods and services trade over time, and you can see that this blue line at the very bottom is our ever-increasing deficit on goods trade. So we import more than we export, so we have a deficit. But what you'll notice on the top is a much smaller but positive line for services where we have a surplus because we are exporting more services than we are importing. And this is something that a lot of people aren't aware of. The other point that we'll make that you can see from this chart is that, oh, it looks like our charts haven't switched yet. There you go. A little bit of a delay. Is that our surplus on services is not only positive, but it's growing. And you can see that here with the exception of 2009 during the recession, we've had this steady growth in the surplus on services since 2003. The reason for that growth in the surplus on services is because export growth is outpacing import growth. And you can see that in this chart here. So services now make up 30% of total exports of goods and services, and services make up 16% of total imports. The U.S. is also the world's largest services exporting country, so it's a very important part of our economy. And as you can see on this chart as well, with the top, the blue line for exports, exports reached record levels in 2010 and again in 2011. And this has been reported on in the press quite a bit, particularly with regards to the National Export Initiative. So the next logical question you can ask is, how do we know all of this? I'm sure you all have probably seen various statistics about services reported in the press, but you might not be aware of where they come from, and that's the other reason why we're here today, is to tell you a little bit about that. BEA collects data on trade and services through mandatory surveys, and these surveys are mandated by the International Investment in Trade and Services Survey Act, which I've shown here. And what this act did basically was require that we not only collect this data, but that we report the statistics on international investment in trade and services so that they could be used by policymakers, businesses, and by the general public. The act also requires that we guarantee the confidentiality of this data, so it can only be used for statistical and analytical purposes. We are prohibited from granting access to the data for tax, investigative, or regulatory purposes. This means that if the IRS comes calling and wants to know about a particular company, we are not even able to confirm whether or not this person is a reporter on one of our surveys, and certainly not able to provide any of their data to them. And this is important because this is how we ensure that companies comply with the requirements. Another implication of the act is that the data collected from individual reporters cannot be published in any way that you would be able to find out who that reporter was or be able to identify their individual data. So for this reason, we have this wealth of data that we collect by company at the enterprise level, but we are not able to publish it at that level. We publish it at an aggregated level. That means that we sum all of the company's transactions together. And we have a very rigorous disclosure analysis process to make sure that no one company's information would be revealed. And if it were to be revealed by giving detail in one particular industry or one particular country, then we would suppress that data item in order to protect their confidentiality. These surveys are also subject to the Paperwork Reduction Act, which is the requirement of the U.S. government in order to minimize burden, particularly on small companies. So as I said, we collect this data on mandatory surveys, and we have several different types of surveys which collect trade in major types of services. We divide them into different categories so that they can be sent to certain companies. So for example, a financial services company would be required to file on our financial services surveys. They may also be required to file on another survey if they have transactions in those types of services. The other categories are, we have a set of surveys related to transportation, a set related to insurance, and then finally selected services and intellectual property. And this is the set of surveys that covers the business and professional services that you think about most often when you think about trade services. So these are things like management and consulting services, R&D, computer and data services, and so on. And then this survey is also where we collect information on intellectual property. So these are, for example, royalties and license fees. Things like royalties that are paid to foreigners, or paid by foreigners to U.S. companies for the right to use their industrial processes, their patents, their copyrights and trademarks, and so on. And then this also covers things like charges for licenses to use or reproduce intellectual property. So this would be something like a license to distribute a film or to distribute things like software. There's other types of fees for different rights that we collect here. So for example, with the upcoming Olympics in London, we can expect to see payments made to the UK by U.S. companies for the rights to broadcast the sporting events on the networks here in the U.S. And one thing I want to mention before we move any further with regards to these surveys is that unlike trade in goods, this information does not need to be reported for each and every transaction. So every time a company provides some sort of legal advice, they have to fill out a form. That's not feasible with the way that we collect the data or with the way the companies keep track of these things in their accounting records. So for that reason, we ask companies to report transactions for a given period. So for a quarterly survey, they'll be asked to report all of their sales and purchases for a given type of service during that quarter. And we collect these data on a couple different types of surveys. So our largest surveys are our benchmark surveys, which are census-type surveys conducted every 5 years. This is where we capture the most complete information by type of service and by country, and it's required by all companies who meet the reporting requirements. However, the smallest companies are only required to report their total sales and purchases. Then we have smaller annual and quarterly surveys, and these are called sample surveys, but they're not sample surveys in the traditional sense that we don't use random sampling. What we use is called cutoff sampling, and this is where we have an exemption level for reporting, which is based on a minimum dollar value of transactions. This minimum value varies by survey, but it's intended to reduce burden on small businesses. So basically, if their sales meet a certain threshold, then they're required to report on these regular surveys. In terms of who's required to report, the surveys are required from U.S. persons, which, again, when we use that term, we're talking statistically, so generally these are companies that are engaging in transactions with foreign residents. So this is any company that's importing or exporting whatever particular type of service is being surveyed. An important thing to note here is that these are not just service-providing companies. So in fact, a lot of firms in manufacturing or other sectors that typically produce goods can also be exporting and importing services. So then they would be required to report on these surveys as well. And then in some cases, a U.S. agent or an intermediary may report transactions on behalf of their clients. For example, we have one transportation survey where we survey the U.S. agents of a foreign airline operator. We collect these data in two ways. The preferred method is our e-file method, and we've shown you the web address here. Our e-file system is pretty nice because it doesn't require any setup costs or any expensive software. Basically, it only requires a web browser and internet access, and a company is given a unique identifier, and they are able to use the e-file system to fill out the forms and send it to us through a secured, encrypted site. If companies prefer not to file on e-file, they can also file on paper, and we have forms which are available at the web address we've shown here. We also do still mail forms to some companies, although we're trying to move away from that in order to save on cost. But the forms can be downloaded from the web, printed out, and can be mailed back to us, or they can be faxed. So that's about what we wanted to say about data collection, and now we're going to talk a little bit about how we use the data, what data are available that you all can make use of. So I'll start by describing our three different products that BEA puts out that provide information on trade and services. The first and earliest look at trade and services is our monthly International Trade in Goods and Services release. This is the monthly press release on the trade deficit, which you, I'm sure, have seen reported in the press. And this is a joint release between the BEA and the U.S. Census Bureau. The Census Bureau is responsible for producing data on trade and goods, and we contribute the trade and services portion of this release. So this release comes out approximately 40 days after the month that it refers to, so it's very timely. And at that time, we do provide data on just 7 broad categories of services. We don't have the survey data at this time to be able to provide more detailed information on services, but it gives you the first look at exports and imports for a particular month. And this, of course, is a very important input into the U.S. gross domestic product, so that's why it's a very closely followed data release. The next data product that includes information on trade and services is our U.S. International Transactions release, and this comes out quarterly. We provide the same information for those 7 broad categories for the quarter, as well as additional detail by service type and some information on exports and imports to a given country. This release comes out 75 days after the end of a quarter, so it comes out in March, June, September, and December. And then the final, most comprehensive report that we put out once a year is our annual International Services Report, and this is the one that I referred to earlier that comes out in October, where we provide the most detail by type of service and by country for exports and imports of services, as well as for services supplied through affiliates, that commercial presence type of service transaction that I talked about earlier. This next slide gives you just a little bit of a snapshot of the detail that we have available on trade and services. We get asked the question a lot of why we don't have as much detail by type of service as we have on trade and goods by commodity. And this is mainly because of the fact that businesses would have to report that information at that level in order for us to be able to come up with statistics on that detailed type of service. And this is something that is a burden issue because companies would have to take the time to compile it, but it's also an issue because companies often don't record this information in their accounting systems at that level of detail. So for that reason, we've come up with what we think is a fairly comprehensive list of types of services, but this is something that we're always working to improve upon. And the next slide actually shows you some changes that we're planning to make to improve the data and the timeliness of the data on trade and services. So you can see here the blue lines represent things that we detail on types of services that we produce annually, which we're planning to accelerate so that we would be providing this information on a quarterly basis. Instead, some of the examples here are some more detail on financial services, such as brokerage and underwriting services, financial management services, and so on. And then the green lines on this chart represent new categories of services that we haven't produced before, but we're planning to implement. One of the examples here is that we're planning to break down travel services into business and personal travel. Some of the uses of the data we thought we would mention here, and then we'll go into a little bit of the specifics of some charts that we have on how you can use the data. But as I mentioned before, together with merchandise trade, trade and services is a key component, a key input into the U.S. gross domestic product. It's also, the data are also used by businesses to make investment decisions and to analyze market size and share. And they're also used by policymakers when negotiating trade agreements. And finally, our data on trade and services are used by researchers and academia to assess the impact of globalization and to address issues like offshoring, which is something we hear about often in the press. So now I'm going to show you a few charts that we put together that show the data on services. And in this case, I focused on exports since that's kind of been the topic of the day. And I know that that we've been talking with Bronwyn about some of the initiatives that are being put forth in LA to promote exports at your level. So we thought we would show you some of the data that we have on exports. So this first pie chart shows you U.S. exports by type of service. So you can see here that exports in 2011 were $608 billion, and that you have the largest type of service here is business, professional, and technical services, kind of the pinkish orange colored one, and then followed by royalties and license fees and travel. This next slide shows the U.S. surplus on services by type of service. So as I mentioned before, the U.S. does run a surplus on services. It was $178 billion in 2011. That's how much more we are exporting and importing. And then you can see here what that surplus is made up of. So we have largely royalties and license fees, financial services, and business, professional, and technical services making up the majority of that surplus. And then this next chart shows those business, professional, and technical services broken out by detailed type of service and what exports the U.S. has to certain Asian countries. So shown here, China, Korea, India, and Singapore. And you can see by looking at these different categories that, for example, the U.S. exports a lot of R&D and testing services to Singapore. That's the tallest light blue line on the chart. And that we also export a large amount of construction, architectural, and engineering services to China, as well as installation, maintenance, and repairs to both China and Korea. So when we talk about exports of maintenance and repairs, that's basically saying that a U.S. company is either sending someone over to do maintenance on equipment in China, or they are sending products here that we're repairing and then sending back. Repairs are kind of a little unusual since they involve goods. So when the good is sent through customs, it's not counted as trade in goods, but in fact just the repair itself is counted as a trade in service. And then this last chart shows a little bit more about U.S. receipts of royalties and license fees. So again, these are receipts that U.S. companies get for allowing foreigners the right to use their intellectual property. And we break this out by the type of intellectual property that's underlying these fees. And I've also shown here by the major regions, so you can see how much is received from Asia, Latin America, Europe, and Canada. And the largest one here is for industrial processes. So these would be mainly manufacturing companies that are allowing foreign companies to use their patented industrial processes, and they're receiving royalties for those. And you can also see on here, in particular for LA, I'm sure important, we have film and television royalties here. That's kind of a little bit smaller, but you can see that a lot of it is coming from Europe. Over half of it is coming from Europe. So they are buying the right to distribute our film and television in their country. And that's all I got. So we're going to give you a quick demo now of our website, and Lucas is going to take back over to show you guys where you can find this information on BEA's website and a little bit more about our site and what it has to offer.
Great, thank you so much. So what I wanted to just give you a quick overview of is the data as well as the data entry elements that Christy spoke of. I just want to give you a little bit of a preview of or a tour of where you can find that information online. So you're looking at a screenshot of the BEA website, which is bea.gov. This is where you'll be able to find and access all of the information we produce, all of the data products we produce, both those related to international trade as well as those that are of the national, regional, or industry accounts. So you'll notice just to start off with here in the middle, in the national accounts, where you're going to find things like gross domestic product, corporate profit, consumer spending, all of those sort of details at the national level. Skipping real quick down to the regional level, this is where you would find, and this may also be very useful information to you, this is where you'll be able to find data related to GDP by state and metro area, personal income by state, metro, and county, as well as something called the Regional Input-Output Multiplier, which is an economic impact multiplier system that the industry accounts, and then we also provide something down here that's referred to as the integrated accounts, which are integration of real and financial economic data. But what I want to primarily point you to is our interactive data system. And you can find that up here at the top in the middle of the website. You'll see it says interactive data. If you click on that, it's going to take you to the next site, which is going to show you how to access the interactive system. And I'm looking at it, and I can see it's taking a while for it to show up on your screen, so I'm just going to kind of slow down a little bit. To look at the data that Christy was talking about, we're going to go into the international section. So you can see here we have two sets of international data. One are the international transactions. The other is the direct investment data. For the purposes of what we're mainly going to be talking about, we're going to be looking at the international transactions, because that's what's going to contain the trade and services data. But direct investment may also be relevant to you. As Christy explained, a trade and service is when you actually have a cross-border transaction or possibly a situation where the service is provided by an affiliate. Whereas foreign direct investment would be when a foreign firm decides to open a location in the United States. Both of these are certainly valuable things, but we track them separately as statistics. So to the extent you're looking at trade and services, we're going to be looking at the international transactions section. So I'll click on that and give it a second to update on your end. While that's coming up, I'll note that you see the large button in the middle of the screen that says Begin Using Data. One other thing I want to note here is all of our interactive systems, regardless of which data product we're talking about, trade and serve profits, whatever it might be, this system is uniform across all the data products. So I'll show it to you in the international section, but please know that it functions the same way regardless of what data you're looking at. We're going to go ahead and click Begin Using the Data. It's going to open up for the international section a list, an accordion-style list of all the various tables that are relevant. Popping up on everyone's screen. Here we go. At the level of Table 1, you'll see the U.S. international transactions. This is going to be the most highly aggregated level of data, and it's going to include both goods and services data. One thing I want to make a quick note of is for some of you who may have used merchandise trade data that is available from the Census Bureau, or if the same data is also available on the International Trade Administration's website, or if you've used a product called USA Trade Online or Trade Stats, all of which are all websites and trade products that are offered by the Department of Commerce, and they're all built off the same data sets that are compiled by BEA and the Census Bureau. However, you will notice a difference between the good merchandise trade data on BEA's website from what you see on the Census website. And I won't go into sort of too much of a difference, but suffice it to say that what the data you're seeing on the Census website, and for that matter on the ITA website, is literally the data about a product that in fact crossed the border. As opposed to, say, when a American airline landed a plane in London and then purchased fuel to refill the plane. Well, that is in fact a trade in goods. An American resident, so to speak, is purchasing goods for a foreigner, but that product didn't in fact cross the border. There was no customs transaction. So when the data you see from BEA, we actually go take it a step further and we include that additional data, and we refer to that as that these data are on a balance of payments basis. It's a very holistic look at the overall trade situation. But if we want to look at some of the private the services transactions, we're going to look at Table 3A. You'll find additional history on Table 3B, but we'll look at 3A for the moment. And giving it a second for that to come up on everyone's screen. Okay. So this is what our interactive system looks like. We're looking at one of the selected tables. You'll notice across the top you're going to have, at each point when you make selections, you're going to get additional tabs across the top. And as you wanted to change any of your variables, it's re-updating the screen. As you want to change any of the variables, you just click back to one of those tabs. You'll also notice that you've got a toolbar across the right side where you see options, chart, download, print, and add to. These are the various functions you can do with the international data. I will note if you're in the regional data sets, you also have the ability to do mapping. But for example, we're looking here at private services transactions, and we're seeing 2010 and 2011 on a quarterly basis. So let's say you wanted to get an idea of how this may have been going on a longer term basis. We would click up here on Show Options, and it's going to pull up a new window that will allow us to make some changes to the parameters. And so we're going to select we'll just go for like a 5 or 6 year frame. I'm going to change this to an annual basis. As Christy mentioned, we produce this data on a quarterly and an annual, and then later a benchmark basis. Quarterly obviously has the least amount of detail, the annual having the larger amount of detail. So for the purposes of the demonstration, I'm going to move to the annual data, and we're going to look at, and then we'll just keep this from going too far. We'll just go to the exports of private services. But you can see here how you would change all your various table options and you need to update. So, whoops, I should have selected something else. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. Hit the wrong button. Okay. So now, as you can see, once the broadcast here catches up with me. Okay, so now as you can see, we've added additional years and we've removed the quarterly basis. And if we were to scroll through this, you begin to get an idea of the level of detail that can be provided. Now, this is only going to be on a type of service basis, whereas in other tables we can look at it on a by country product type of service by country basis. But you can get a quick sense here. And what I mainly want to show you, other than the options section that you saw, is also the ability to chart these things. Often with data, it's far more useful to have the ability to visualize it. If you were to pull up the charting function, and I'm just going to, just for the sake of demonstration, we're just going to click on the one button and we're going to chart just the overall exports of private services over the last 5 years. Obviously not a particularly dynamic chart, given that a highly aggregated number like that isn't likely to change that much in that short period of time. But you get the idea. And you can also switch over here to a bar chart basis. This is very easily exported into a PNG file, which you can drop right into a PowerPoint or to a Word document or a report that you might be writing. The other thing we'll point out here is that you can download all of this data. As you select each of the data tables, you can download them. They're available in XLS, CSV, and PDF format. So if you're the analytical type and want to drop your data into data or FAME or SAS and do additional manipulation, you can do that by easily pulling it down in a CSV file. Or for those of us who are a little less mathematically inclined, dropping it into an Excel file so you can do some basic manipulation. A pretty easy option. You can also print, and then you can use the add this function to dispense this over social media. A couple of final things I want to show you about the interactive system. If we scroll back up just a little bit, you'll notice over here on the tab that my mouse is pointing to that you'll see and you'll see this will be true on all the tabs that you're going to be looking at. I know many of you aren't seeing this yet, so here we go. On any of these tabs, you're going to see I guess that's a floppy disk looking icon. One of the things that we built into this new system is the ability for you to create, and you'll do this over here on the sign in register section, for you to create a login, and then as you create each of the various queries that you might use on data to save them, so that you don't have to recreate them each time you're pulling that data. So at any point you can use that save button to save the queries you built to your account. The other button you'll see next to that is looks kind of like a chain, or maybe a chain, maybe the link of a chain, hence the name. And so it is in fact giving you a static link to the table you're looking at. If you were to just copy and paste the URL at the top of the screen, that will not work. It's not a static URL, but that link icon will give you a static URL. So you can easily email the table to a colleague or bookmark it to go back. A couple of other things I want to show you about the BEA website. I'm going to return here to the home screen. And what I wanted to show you is a couple of quick things. One is, you'll notice down here at the bottom, stay connected with BEA. You can follow our data on Twitter, on RSS. We do have a blog, as well as we offer email updates. So, for example, if you're particularly interested in the regular ongoing data publications related to trade and services, you could sign up for an email notification, and we'll let you know the morning of each day that those types of data are released. Likewise, if you might be interested in keeping up with estimates of personal income or GDP for your metro area or for California, you could sign up for the email notification for each of those products as well. I also would be remiss not to note the relatively recently launched BEA blog. As a building full of economists and statisticians, we like to think we always have something interesting to say. I'll leave it to others to decide whether or not that's really true, but nonetheless, we would certainly invite you to take a look. And then the final thing I want to show you here is within the international realm, which is what we've been discussing. We have a couple of things on that page that I think would be important for you to know. Waiting for just to catch up with us. But I'm going to click on the international button at the top of the screen. It will take you to the portion of the website that is specific to the international accounts. And here we go. And here you'll be able to find a wealth of additional information about the national accounts, the international transactions accounts, trade and services. But specifically what I want to show you is the survey forms and related materials. So if you notice on the right side of your screen, about midway down on the blue panel, you see a button that says Survey Forms and Related Materials. If you click on that, it'll take you to the section of the page that has links to all of the surveys that Christy mentioned. It has a link to a summary file that will give you some basic information about each of the surveys, who responds to them, what the reporting thresholds are, what the frequency of the surveys are. So you'll find that information here under U.S. International Services Transactions. Obviously, these other categories are for other types of surveys that we use. What you'll see here is a list of all the surveys. If you were to click on any of those, you would actually get to see the actual survey. They kind of look like tax forms. And then you'd also see at the top there's a summary of the reporting requirements. The final thing that we want to show you is we return back to the main screen. On about midway down the left side, under Information 4, you'll notice a button for the e-file system. So for any of you or the businesses and firms you work with, you can choose to use trade and services and fall under the reporting threshold. They can report on an electronic basis, and you do that directly from our website. I think at that point, Christy, was there anything else you wanted specifically to point out?
No, I think that's it.
All right. So I'm going to switch the screen back here, and we'll leave it up with our contact information. We invite you to don't hesitate to let us know if you have any additional questions or concerns. And at this point, I think we'll be happy to take any questions, or Bronwyn, turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Lucas and Christy. That was excellent information.